A man was found dead, and nobody in the Jewish quarter would say a word about how it happened. Not the elders, not the rabbis, not the merchants who had sat in the same room as the men who ordered it. For weeks afterward, when Polish officials asked questions, the answer was always the same: a shrug, a blank look. He drank too much, he fell, he had enemies, who knows. The community closed around the silence, like water closing over a stone. But the silence was the point. Because this was not a robbery gone wrong, it was not a tavern brawl. It was a sentence. A man had been condemned to die by a body that was never supposed to have that power, a Jewish parliament that met twice a year at a Polish trade fair to argue about taxes and printing rights and who owed what to the king. On paper they had no army, no prison, no gallows, and no legal right to take a single life, and yet a life had been taken, quietly, deliberately, with the kind of organization that only comes from people who have done this before. His crime had a name in their law, a word older than Poland itself. He was a Moser, an informer, and in the world he lived in, that was the one thing you could not be and expect to keep breathing. So, how did a parliament with no power to execute anyone end up ordering an execution? Why did they decide this one man was so dangerous that the normal punishments, the fines, the bans, the public shaming simply would not do? And why, almost 400 years later, do we still know so little about who actually carried it out? This is the story of the Council of Four Lands, the most powerful Jewish institution in the world at the time, and the year their patience finally ran out. To understand why a group of merchants and rabbis would order a man killed, you have to understand the strange, fragile, almost impossible thing they had built. For most of the medieval period, Jews across Europe lived at the mercy of whoever happened to be ruling them. They could be taxed into poverty, expelled overnight, blamed for plagues, accused of crimes they had nothing to do with. England threw them out in 1290. France did it more than once. The German lands were a patchwork of small expulsions and worse. Wherever Jews went, they were tolerated as long as they were useful and discarded the moment they were not. Poland was different. Not perfect, not safe, but different. By the second half of the 16th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had become the largest Jewish home on earth. Kings needed people who could lend money, run estates, manage trade, and collect revenue, and the nobility needed the same. Jews filled those roles, and in exchange they were granted something almost unheard of anywhere else in Europe. They were allowed to govern themselves, and they did not do it in a small way. They built an entire system. At the bottom were the local communities, the kahals, each one running its own affairs in its own town. Above them sat regional councils, and above everything, at the very top of the pyramid, sat the body that historians would later call the most developed institution in all of European Jewish history. The Council of Four Lands. The name comes from the four great provinces it represented: Greater Poland, Little Poland, Ruthenia, Volhynia. Delegates from across these lands, somewhere around 70 men at the height of it, would gather twice a year at the enormous trade fairs. The spring fair at Lublin and the late summer fair at Jarosław. Picture it. Thousands of merchants pouring into a single town. Goods from across the continent changing hands. And in the middle of all that noise and money, a group of the most respected Jews in the kingdom, sitting down to govern a population of hundreds of thousands. The Poles had a name for it, too. They called it the Jewish Sejm, the Jewish Parliament. In Latin documents it appears as the General Congress of the Jews. That is exactly what it functioned as. Think about what that actually meant in practice. The fairs at Lublin ran for weeks, starting around the Catholic holiday of Candlemas in early February, and the whole town transformed. The Jewish quarter of Lublin sat right by the Grodska Gate, the stone gateway that physically divided the Christian city from the Jewish one. Through that gate poured merchants and scholars and tax collectors and lobbyists from every corner of the kingdom. The council had its own court, the Tribunal of the Waad, modeled directly on the Polish Crown Tribunal that met in the same city. So, you had this remarkable thing, a Jewish high court sitting in the same town as the highest Polish court, hearing appeals from across the Jewish world, applying its own law, enforcing its own rulings. Two parallel systems of justice, Christian and Jewish, operating in the same crowded streets, and it had real teeth in the matters it was allowed to touch. The council could disqualify the elders of a community and order everyone to stop recognizing them. It could ban a man across the entire country and send word of that ban to Prague, to the Holy Land, to communities hundreds of miles away. It regulated the Hebrew printing presses so tightly that no book could be printed in Poland without the permission of the rabbis and lay authorities, and a book printed abroad in violation of those rules could not be sold in Polish lands at all. When you read what this body actually did, the word parliament stops feeling like an exaggeration and starts feeling almost too modest. Now here is where it gets interesting, because this council was not mostly made up of rabbis. The men who ran it were lay leaders, wealthy merchants and communal notables, the parnasim, the elders. They held the real power, but they leaned heavily on the great rabbis for one specific thing: legitimacy. A merchant could decide something, but a rabbi could make it holy. He could attach the weight of Jewish law to a ruling and turn a political decision into a religious obligation. That partnership, money and law working together, is the engine that makes this entire story possible. The council did everything a real government does. It assessed and collected the enormous taxes the Jewish population owed to the Polish crown, sums that ran into the hundreds of thousands. It passed binding regulations on everything from how books could be printed to how big a wedding could be. It settled disputes between communities. It funded schools and charity and emergency relief. And it sent its own lobbyists, the Stadlanem, to the Polish parliament in Warsaw, armed with money and gifts and careful words to protect Jewish rights before the king and the nobles. But all of this rested on one thing, and it is the most important thing in this entire story. The council had no power that the Polish state did not allow it to have. Every privilege, every right of self-government existed only because the king and the nobility found it useful. It could all be taken away. The Jews of Poland knew it. They knew exactly how thin the ice was beneath them. So when something threatened to crack that ice, when one of their own threatened to bring the whole structure down, they did not treat it as a private quarrel. They treated it as a matter of survival, because that is exactly what it was. And the thing that threatened them most was not the Polish state at all. It was a particular kind of person from inside their own community. There is an old word in Jewish law. The people of the council knew it the way you know the name of a disease that killed someone in your family. The word is Moser. It comes from a root that means to hand over, to deliver up. A Moser is someone who hands a fellow Jew, or the property of a fellow Jew, over to a hostile authority, the informer. To understand how seriously they took this, you have to understand how the law treated it. The Talmud, the great body of Jewish legal tradition, compared the informer to a serpent, not a thief, not a liar. A serpent, something whose very nature is to bring death, and the punishment laid down for the Moser was not a fine, and it was not exile. According to the legal tradition, the informer could be put to death. Even after Jewish courts lost almost all their power to punish serious crimes, This one exception was understood to remain in force precisely because of how much damage an informer could do. Why so harsh? Why would handing information to the authorities be treated as worse than almost any other crime? Because of how vulnerable the whole community was. Back to that thin ice. A single Jew who went to a Polish official with a story, true or false, could trigger a chain reaction. He could provoke a fine on the entire community. He could spark an accusation that spread from one man to thousands. He could hand a greedy noble or a hostile clergyman exactly the excuse they were looking for: to seize property, to revoke privileges, to start a persecution. One man's mouth could become a catastrophe for everyone, and the Jews of Poland had watched it happen. They had seen how easily a private grudge could metastasize into a public disaster. They had seen how a single denunciation could undo years of careful work by the Stadlanem in Warsaw. To them, the informer was not just a traitor. He was a weapon pointed at the heart of the community, and the trigger could be pulled by anyone with a grievance and a willingness to talk. Now, most informers never got near a death sentence. The council and the local communities had a whole ladder of punishments before they ever reached that final rung. The most powerful of these was the herem, the ban. We translate it as excommunication, but that word is too gentle for what it actually was. A man under herem was cut off completely. No one could pray with him. No one could do business with him. No one could eat with him, marry into his family, or even, in the most severe cases, speak to him. His children could become unmarriageable. His name could be published across Poland and sent to communities abroad, to Prague, to the Holy Land, so that the ban followed him wherever he fled. In a world where your entire economic and social life ran through your community, the herem was not a slap on the wrist. It was a kind of social death. For many men, it was worse than a fine and more frightening than prison. The council used this constantly. It was their main instrument of enforcement. Because remember, they had no jails and no executioners of their own. Their power was the power of the community to close ranks and freeze a man out. And usually, that was enough. Usually, the threat alone brought people back into line. But the man in our story was not most men, and his crime was not most crimes. Because to understand what he did and why even the herem was not considered enough, you have to understand the single most dangerous business a Jew in Poland could possibly be in. Here is something that surprises people. The Council of Four Lands, the great defender of Polish Jewry, actually forbade Jews from doing one of the most profitable things available to them. They did it on purpose, knowing it cost their own people money. The business was tax farming, or to be precise, the leasing of customs duties and state revenues. Let me explain how it worked, because it is the key to everything. In this period, the Polish crown and the great nobles did not collect many of their own taxes directly. Instead, they auctioned off the right to collect them. A man would pay a large sum up front for the lease, the contract to collect a particular customs duty or toll or revenue stream. Then he would go out and collect as much as he could. Whatever he collected above what he had paid, he kept. It was enormously lucrative. It required exactly the skills that many Jewish merchants had in abundance: capital, literacy, accounting, connections. So Jews entered this business in significant numbers, and the council watched it happen with growing alarm. Because the tax farmer was, by the nature of his job, the most hated man in any district, he was the one knocking on doors, demanding money. He was the one squeezing peasants and townsmen and merchants for every coin. And when that hated figure was visibly, identifiably Jewish, the resentment did not stay personal. It generalized. The Christian population did not say, "That particular leaseholder is a hard man." They said, "The The Jews are bleeding us dry. The council saw the trap with brutal clarity. In its own words, recorded in its rulings, the problem with Jewish revenue farmers was that, in their pursuit of gain, they gave rise to accusations against Jews in general and inflamed the Christian populace against them. The greed of a few, the council understood, would buy a pogrom for the many. There was also a second danger, a legal and political one. The Polish system was shot through with the old canonical principle that Jews must not hold any office that gave them power over Christians. A Jewish tax farmer collecting money from Christian subjects was a walking violation of that principle, an irritant to the church and to the nobility, a standing provocation. Every Jewish customs lessee was, in effect, an argument waiting to be used against every Jew in the kingdom. There was a third layer to it, quieter but just as dangerous. The Polish nobility wanted those revenues for themselves. Customs duties, tolls, the leasing of state income, these were exactly the prizes the great magnates were fighting over. When a Jewish merchant outbid a Christian noble for a lucrative lease, he did not just make money. He made a powerful enemy, the kind of enemy who sat in the Sejm in Warsaw, the kind of enemy who could push for new restrictions on all Jews out of spite over a single contract. The council understood that every aggressive Jewish leaseholder was not only inflaming the common people, but also stepping directly on the toes of the men whose goodwill kept the whole community alive. It was, from their point of view, the worst possible way to get rich. You angered the poor and the powerful at the same time. So the council acted. As far back as 1580, in one of its earliest and most solemn rulings, it confirmed and reinforced a government edict forbidding Jews from leasing the collection of state taxes and customs in the central provinces, Great Poland, Little Poland, and Mazovia, and it kept returning to the issue for generations. The Lithuanian Council, the sister body to the north that had split off in 1623 to govern the Jews of the Grand Duchy, debated the same painful question. Everyone could see the money. Everyone could also see the danger sitting right behind the money. Now here is the honest, complicated truth, the part that does not flatter anyone. The ban was never fully obeyed. It could not be. The profits were simply too large, and the temptation too constant. Wealthy Jews kept slipping into the customs business, sometimes openly, sometimes through Christian frontmen, sometimes by simply ignoring a ruling they found inconvenient. The council would forbid it, and individuals would do it anyway. The council would forbid it again. It is one of the clearest cases in their entire history of leadership, knowing exactly what was best for the collective and being unable to make every individual comply. And this is the world our story lives in, a world where the most profitable business was also the most forbidden, where the men who got rich from it were, in the eyes of their own leadership, gambling with everyone's safety, and where the relationships between rival Jewish leaseholders, all of them fighting over the same lucrative contracts, could turn poisonous in a hurry. Because when there is that much money on the table, that much danger, sooner or later, somebody decides to win by playing dirty. Somebody decides to talk. Now we come to the man himself. Here I have to be honest with you about what we know and what we do not. The records of the Council of Four Lands survive only in fragments. The original minute books, the Pinkasim, were scattered, copied, lost, and in many cases destroyed over the centuries, with the worst losses coming in the catastrophes that fell on Polish Jewry again and again. What we have are pieces, rulings copied into other books, quotations preserved by later scholars, echoes. The great 20th century historians who reconstructed this institution were working like archaeologists piecing together a skeleton from bones found in a dozen different places. So, when we talk about a customs informer condemned in this period, we are not talking about a case with a court transcript and a signed confession. We are talking about the kind of event the council had every reason to record carefully and every reason to bury completely. They needed their own people to know that informing carried the ultimate price, and they needed the Polish authorities to never, ever find proof that a Jewish body had ordered a man's death. Those two needs pulled in opposite directions. The result is exactly the kind of half-buried, half-remembered story we are dealing with. But the shape of it is clear. It fits everything we know about how this world worked. Picture a man, a Jewish merchant, who had gone into the customs business in defiance of the council's ban. He was, by the standards of his community, doing well in the most dangerous way possible. He had money, he had a lease, and he had rivals, other men, Jewish and Christian both, who wanted the contract he was sitting on, and at some point this man did the unthinkable. When a dispute went against him, when a rival threatened his position, when the community tried to discipline him, he went to the Polish authorities. He carried information out of the Jewish world and handed it to powerful Christians. Maybe it was about a competitor's business. Maybe it was about the community's finances, its tax dealings, the quiet arrangements that kept the whole fragile structure running. Maybe he threatened to expose the very fact that Jews were still leasing customs in violation of both Jewish rulings and Polish expectations. Whatever it was, it crossed the line that no amount of money could buy back. He had become a Moser. The serpent was inside the house. Here is what made him so much more dangerous than an ordinary informer. He was not some marginal figure with nothing to lose. He was a man embedded in the most sensitive business there was, with access to exactly the kind of information that could detonate. An ordinary man's denunciation might cause one community a bad year. This man's denunciations could pull the thread that unraveled the entire arrangement that let Polish Jews govern themselves. He could prove to the nobles that the Jewish self-government was operating outside the lines. He could show the crown that its own edicts were being ignored. He could turn the council's greatest strength, its quiet autonomy, to the evidence of a crime. The community tried the normal tools first. We can be almost certain of that, because that is how they always operated. There would have been warnings. There would have been pressure from the elders, almost certainly. There would have been the threat of harem, or the harem itself, that social death that broke most men. They would have leaned on his family, his business partners, anyone who could reach him. It did not work. He kept talking, or he threatened to keep talking. He gambled that his usefulness to the Christian authorities made him untouchable, that the very protection he was buying from the Poles put him beyond the reach of his own people. He was wrong. But to understand why he was wrong, we have to go inside the room where the decision was made, and we have to understand the moment, because the early 1640s were not a calm time to be gambling with the safety of Polish Jewry. The great catastrophe was still a few years off, the Cossack uprising of 1648 that would tear through the Jewish communities of the East and kill tens of thousands, the disaster that historians would later treat as a turning point in the whole history of the Jews in Poland. But the tensions that fed it were already building. Resentment of Jewish leaseholders and estate managers in the borderlands, a nobility growing more reckless, a church pressing harder. The men of the council could not see the exact shape of what was coming, but they could feel the pressure rising. They lived with a constant, low awareness that the arrangement protecting them was under strain. that the wrong spark at the wrong moment could set the whole thing alight. An informer handing ammunition to hostile powers in that climate was not a manageable nuisance. He was a man playing with fire in a house full of straw, so picture the fare. Lublin, most likely in the year 1642, crowded weeks when the council gathered. The streets jammed with carts and merchants and animals, the inns full. And somewhere in the Jewish quarter, in a room you would have walked past without a second glance, the most powerful Jews in the kingdom sitting down to decide whether one of their own should die. This was not a decision they could make lightly, not only for moral reasons, it was physically, legally terrifying for them to even consider it. Remember what they were, a body with no legal right to execute anyone. The power of life and death in Poland belonged to the crown, to the nobles, to the royal courts, not to a council of Jewish merchants. If word got out that the Jewish parliament had ordered an execution, it would hand their enemies the single most damning weapon imaginable. It would prove that the Jews were running a shadow state, a secret government with its own death penalty, operating in defiance of Polish law. It was the exact accusation that could end Jewish self-government entirely and bring catastrophe down on every community in the kingdom. So why do it? Why take that enormous existential risk? Because the alternative was worse. Because a living, talking informer of this particular kind was a threat that the harem could not contain. You can freeze a man out of the community, but you cannot freeze his mouth shut. As long as he was alive and willing to talk, he held a knife to the throat of everyone. The council faced a brutal piece of arithmetic. The risk of acting against him was enormous. The risk of doing nothing was the destruction of everything, and the law gave them a door. Not an easy door, but a real one. The death penalty for the Moser was the one capital punishment that the Jewish legal tradition had preserved through all the centuries of exile, precisely for situations exactly like this. The great rabbis could be brought in. They could examine the case, weigh the danger, rule that this man met the ancient standard, that he was a true Moser, a serpent whose continued life endangered the lives of the community. With that ruling, a political assassination became something else in their eyes. It became the lawful execution of a sentence sanctioned by the holiest authorities they recognized. This is where the partnership we talked about earlier, money and law, becomes a matter of life and death in the most literal sense. The lay leaders had the will and the organization. The rabbis had the authority to make it permissible. Neither could do it alone. Together, in that room, they could turn a killing into a verdict. We do not have the names of the men who sat in that room. We do not have the words they spoke or the votes they cast. That, more than anything, tells you how carefully this was handled. The council kept meticulous records of taxes and printing rights and wedding sizes. On this, the silence is almost total. Silence that complete is not an accident. It is a decision. It is men who understood with perfect clarity that the only way to survive what they were about to do was to make sure it could never be proven they had done it. So they did not write it down. They did not announce it. They chose the one method that left no paper, no trial, no public record. They chose to make it disappear. Here is the part that gives this story its dark, almost unbelievable quality. The Council of Four Lands had no executioner. There was no official position, no hooded figure, no gallows in the Jewish quarter. And yet a man died on their order. So how? The honest answer is that we do not have a signed manual explaining the mechanics, and anyone who claims otherwise is inventing it. But we can reconstruct the logic, because the logic is not mysterious. It is the logic of any community that needs something done and needs it too. Never be traced back to a meeting room. the sentence would have been handed down quietly to a small circle. The fewer people who knew, the safer everyone was. Then the actual deed would have been carried out by men acting in the dark, men whose connection to the council could be denied by everyone. Perhaps members of the community who saw themselves as carrying out a sacred and necessary duty. Perhaps men who were simply paid and told nothing. The whole design of it was deniability. If the Polish authorities came asking, every single person, from the highest elder to the lowest hired hand, could look them in the eye and know nothing. The killing itself would not have looked like an execution. That was the entire point. It would have looked like an accident, or a robbery, or a drunken misfortune, or a simple disappearance. A man found in a river. A man set upon by thieves on a dark road outside town. A man who left on a journey and never arrived. A man who quietly stopped being anywhere at all. The Jewish world was full of travel, of merchants on the roads between fairs, of men who came and went. It was not hard to make one more man fail to come back. It was not hard for everyone who knew why to agree, forever, that they had no idea what happened to him. This is what the title of secret executioners really means. Not a standing institution, not an order of assassins with robes and oaths. Something quieter and, in a way, more chilling. A community that, when pushed to the absolute edge, could reach a collective decision to end a life, and then close around that decision so completely that 4 centuries later we are still squinting at the shadows, trying to make out what happened, and it worked. That is the thing you have to sit with. It worked. The man was gone. The threat he posed died with him. The information he might have carried to the Polish authorities went into the ground with his body, and the council's role in it stayed exactly where they wanted it. In the dark, the Christian authorities, if they ever suspected, could prove nothing. There was no body that told a story, no witness who would talk, no document with a seal on it. There was only a dead informer and an entire community that had, all at once, gone deaf and blind. But before we leave that room and that road, we have to be fair, and we have to be honest, because it would be easy to tell this story as if the Jews were simply defending themselves. That is not the whole truth. It would be comfortable to wrap this in a neat moral package. A persecuted people, threatened by a traitor, doing what they had to do to survive. And there is real truth in that. The danger was real. The thin ice was real. The history of expulsions and accusations and pogroms was real, and it was recent and it was constant. But honesty demands more than that. Start with the informer himself, the man we are tempted to cast as a pure villain. Why did he talk? Often, in cases like this, the informer was not some agent of evil. He was a man who had lost a fight. He had been on the wrong end of the community's power, disciplined by the elders, beaten in a business dispute, ruined or threatened with ruin by men who had more influence than he did. The council and the local communities did not always wield their power justly. The harem, that terrible weapon, could be used to settle scores, to crush rivals, to protect the wealthy and connected against the weak. A man who went to the Polish authorities was sometimes a man who believed, rightly or wrongly, that he could get no justice from his own people. Turning to the outside power was, for some of these men, the only court of appeal they had left. That does not excuse betraying the whole community to save yourself. But it complicates the picture. The serpent in the house was sometimes a man the house had already bitten. Then, there is the matter of the customs business itself, the thing at the root of all of this. The council banned Jews from tax farming because of the danger, yes. But notice what that means. Jewish leaseholders really were doing the squeezing. They really were collecting hard money from poor Christians and keeping the profit. The resentment that the council feared was not invented out of pure prejudice. There was a real grievance underneath it, dressed up and exaggerated by hatred, but real at the core. The council's own rulings admit it plainly. Their people, in pursuit of gain, were creating the danger. The leadership was not protecting innocents. It was trying to manage the consequences of its own community's most aggressive and lucrative behavior. And the leaders were not saints, sitting in judgment from some height of pure principle. Many of them were wealthy men with their own businesses, their own rivalries, their own interests. When the council decided that this particular informer was too dangerous to live, we should at least ask whose interests his death served. A dead informer protected the community, certainly. But he might also have protected specific powerful men whose own dealings he could have exposed. The line between a public execution for the common good and a private murder, dressed in the language of law, is not always as bright as the people, drawing it, would like to believe. This is the uncomfortable heart of it. The council was, at the same time, a genuine shield for a vulnerable people and a body of powerful men capable of using sacred law to eliminate an inconvenient enemy. Both things are true. The killing was, very possibly, necessary for survival. It was also, very possibly, convenient for some of the men who ordered it. History does not make us choose between those readings. It asks us to hold them both. What is not in doubt is the fear. Whatever mix of survival and self-interest and genuine conviction went into that decision, it was made by people who were genuinely, reasonably afraid. They had every historical reason to believe that one talking informer could bring the whole structure down. They were not wrong about the stake stick, even if they may have been wrong or self-serving about this particular man. So the deed was done. The sentence was carried out. The road swallowed a man, or the river did, and the community fell silent. The question is what happened next, in the days and weeks immediately after, when the informer was gone, and the fair was still going on, and the council still had to function as if nothing had happened at all. The first days after, the most striking thing is how little visibly changed, and that again was by design. The fair went on. The carts kept rolling into Lublin. The merchants kept trading. The council kept meeting, kept arguing over tax assessments and communal debts and the 100 ordinary matters that filled its sessions. To any outside observer, it was business as usual, a council of Jewish notables doing exactly the dull and necessary work it had always done. There was no announcement, no marked change in the rhythm of the fair, no sign at all that one of the most serious things a community can do had just been done. Inside the community, the silence settled in and hardened. This was the critical period, the dangerous window when a careless word could undo everything. If a single person had talked to the wrong Polish official, if a rival or a grieving relative had gone to the authorities with a real accusation, the entire calculation could have reversed. The thing the council most feared, an investigation, a proof, a scandal that exposed Jewish self-government as a shadow state with a death penalty, was most likely to ignite in exactly these first days, while the body was fresh and tongues were loose. So the community did the one thing that protected everyone. It agreed, without needing to say so out loud, on a single version of events. The man had died of ordinary causes. The man had met with an accident. The man had simply gone away. Whatever the official story was, everyone told it, and everyone kept telling it, and the people who knew the truth understood that their own safety depended on the story holding. A grieving widow, an angry brother, a curious neighbor, all of them were absorbed into the same protective silence, whether they wanted to be or not. For the Polish authorities, if they noticed at all there was nothing to grab onto. A Jewish customs man had died. Such men made enemies. Such men traveled dangerous roads with money on them. If anyone in the administration had a flicker of suspicion that this was something more, they had no body that told a story, no witness who would break, no document anywhere with a name and an order on it. The case, if it was ever even a case, went nowhere. There was nothing to investigate but a closed community and a convenient explanation. It helped that the Polish state, for all its power over the Jews, rarely had much appetite for digging into the internal affairs of a community that paid its taxes on time. As long as the money flowed up to the crown and the nobles, what happened inside the Jewish quarter was, to a large degree, the Jews' own business. That was the bargain that made self-government possible in the first place. In a strange way, it was the same bargain that made the killing possible. The council had been handed the authority to run its own affairs precisely so that the Polish state would not have to. An official who started pulling at the thread of a dead informer would have been pulling at the entire arrangement, asking questions that nobody in power particularly wanted answered. It was easier for everyone, Christian and Jewish alike, to let a hard man's death stay exactly what it appeared to be, an unfortunate end on a dangerous road, and for the informers who might come after him, the message landed exactly as intended. This was, in the end, the purpose of the whole grim exercise, not just to remove this one man, but to teach a lesson to every man who might be tempted to follow his path. The lesson was simple, and it did not need to be written down anywhere. There is a line. You may be rich. You may be useful to powerful Christians. You may believe yourself untouchable. None of that will save you if you cross it. The community can reach you. The community has reached people before, and when it does, there will be no trial you can appeal, no record anyone will admit to, and no one who will ever say a word about what happened to you. That message moved through the Jewish world the way such things always move, not in documents, but in whispers, in the careful glances of men who understood more than they would ever say. A would-be informer did not need to know the details. He only needed to know that they were possible, that a man in his position had crossed the line and was now simply gone, that the most powerful body in Jewish Poland had let it be known in the language of silence, that this was how such things ended. The council, for its part, returned fully to the work it existed to do. Within weeks, the session would close. The delegates would scatter back to their towns and provinces, carrying the ordinary business of the fair, the rulings on taxes and trade and communal life, and carrying, a few of them, something they would never write in any pinkas and never speak of in any room with a window. They had been part of a body that, for one moment, had done the thing no one wanted to admit a Jewish parliament could do, and then they had folded that moment up and put it away so completely that it nearly vanished from history altogether. The fair ended. The merchants went home. The roads emptied. And somewhere along one of those roads, under the water of some river, or in a grave no one marked, was a man who had gambled that talking to the Polish authorities would make him safe. He had been the serpent in the house. The house had decided he could not stay in it. And the house, when it had known exactly how to make a serpent disappear, and exactly how to look the Polish authorities in the eye afterward and tell them with one voice and complete conviction that nobody knew a thing. If you found this history interesting, this next video will shock you. Click right here to watch it now.